I found out my husband's biggest secret wasn't another woman, or a hidden debt, or anything I'd spent years quietly bracing myself for. It was everyone else's heartbreak. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, for the better part of a year, my husband, Evan, sat across from me at dinner, asked about my day, loaded the dishwasher, and behaved, in every visible way, like an ordinary, present partner. What I didn't know was that most of those same afternoons, sitting alone in his car in a parking garage 3 blocks from the family law firm where he worked as a paralegal, he was recording voice memos, detailed, clinical breakdowns of real, ongoing divorce cases from his own firm's confidential files, sold anonymously to a true crime-adjacent podcast that had, without my knowledge, turned our own quiet town's most private tragedies into a weekly, monetized show. My name is Claire. I'm 36 years old, and 3 weeks ago, I discovered that my husband had spent nearly a year violating attorney-client privilege, professional confidentiality rules, and the trust of people we actually knew, our neighbors, our own friends' relatives, people whose divorces he had legitimate professional access to and no legal right whatsoever to discuss anywhere outside that office. This is the story of how I found out, what it actually cost the people whose lives he turned into content, and the exact moment a couple 2 streets over recognized their own marriage in one of his episodes. I need to tell you who Evan was before all of this, because the specific quiet, steady quality of our marriage is exactly what made this betrayal so difficult to see coming, and so disorienting once I finally did. Evan and I met 8 years ago, and married 5 years into our relationship, settling into a small, close-knit town where he'd taken a position as a paralegal at a well-regarded family law firm, a job he described, consistently, as meaningful in a quiet, unglamorous way, helping people through some of the hardest transitions of their lives, organizing documents, preparing filings, supporting attorneys who were, in his own telling, doing genuinely important work for families in crisis. I want to be honest that I found his professional discretion, over the years, something I actively admired about him. He never discussed specific cases, never gossiped about clients, maintained what I understood to be an appropriately serious boundary around confidential work he took seriously. I remember, more than once, telling friends how much I respected that quality in him, a man who understood the weight of other people's private pain and treated it accordingly. I understand now, with the specific, sickening clarity that comes only in hindsight, exactly how that carefully maintained public discretion coexisted with something considerably darker happening in parallel. Evan wasn't simply respecting client confidentiality in his professional life while keeping his personal life separate. He was, apparently, extracting exactly the details he claimed to be protecting, packaging them for public consumption, and profiting from precisely the trust his firm's clients had placed in him. Our life together, in every other visible respect, felt entirely ordinary and genuinely happy. We had a modest, comfortable house, a small circle of close friends we saw regularly, a rhythm to our weeks that felt, from the inside, like exactly the kind of steady partnership I'd always hoped to build. Evan coached a youth soccer team on Saturday mornings, volunteered occasionally at our town's small library, was, by every visible measure available to me, a genuinely engaged, present member of our community. I mention all of this not to generate sympathy for him, but because I think it matters for understanding how someone capable of this specific, sustained deception can simultaneously be, in every other observable way, a person who seems entirely trustworthy and good. The podcast itself, once I finally understood what I was looking at, was called Marriage Autopsy, a true crime-adjacent show that had, over roughly 18 months, built a genuinely substantial audience around detailed, dramatized breakdowns of real divorce cases, framed around an anonymous, recurring narrator the show credited only as the paralegal, someone the hosts described, in promotional material I would eventually find, as having unparalleled access to the real, unfiltered story behind the paperwork. I want to describe the specific production quality of the show once I actually looked into it more closely, because I think it matters for understanding the scale of what Evan had actually become part of, rather than some small, obscure side project. The show had a professional editing team, sponsorship deals with several recognizable consumer brands, and a dedicated, active social media presence with hundreds of thousands of followers across multiple platforms, several of whom regularly commented on individual episodes with theories and reactions about the real people involved, entirely unaware they were actually discussing genuine, identifiable individuals rather than composite, fictionalized characters. I discovered the show's existence almost entirely by accident. A close friend, Megan, mentioned it to me in passing during a coffee catch-up, describing an episode she'd found genuinely gripping the night before, detailing what she called an absolutely wild divorce case involving a hidden business, a secret second property, and a specific, memorable detail about a couple's disagreement over a family dog that had, according to Megan, made the entire internet fall in love with the story. I remember feeling only mild, distant curiosity at first, the kind you feel hearing about any moderately interesting podcast a friend recommends. It wasn't until Megan described a second detail from that same episode, a specific, unusual argument over a vintage record collection, that something cold and specific settled into my stomach. I knew that detail. Not from any podcast. From an actual conversation Evan and I had had, months earlier, about a case at his own firm, one he'd mentioned only in the vaguest possible terms before catching himself and changing the subject, citing confidentiality. That I want to spend a moment on that specific vintage record collection detail, because it's the exact thread that unraveled everything else, and I think small, specific details like this one matter for understanding how these discoveries actually happen in real life, rather than through some dramatic, singular reveal. Evan and I had discussed his work in only the vaguest possible terms across our entire marriage, per his consistent, professional discretion. But roughly 4 months before I discovered the podcast, he had mentioned, almost as an aside during an ordinary dinner conversation, that he'd had a genuinely strange day at work involving what he described only as a couple fighting over the weirdest thing, before catching himself, laughing it off, and changing the subject entirely, citing confidentiality the way he always did whenever a conversation edged too close to actual case details. I hadn't thought about that specific dinner conversation again in the 4 months since it happened, filing it away as simply one of dozens of similarly vague, quickly redirected mentions of his work over the years. It was only hearing Megan describe that same specific, unusual detail, a record collection, of all things, that the memory surfaced again, with a specificity that made the coincidence impossible to simply dismiss as ordinary chance. That I listened to that episode alone, late that same night, in a state of escalating, disbelieving horror I don't think I've fully recovered from even now. The episode described, in considerable, specific detail, a divorce case that matched, point for point, a case I now understood, with total certainty, belonged to an actual couple I recognized, not personally close friends, but people whose names I knew, whose faces I'd seen at our town's single grocery store, whose divorce, according to this podcast episode, had been dissected for an audience of tens of thousands of strangers, using details that could only have come from someone with direct, professional access to their confidential legal files. The show's format, I quickly understood listening through several more episodes that same night, followed a consistent pattern. The paralegal would walk the hosts through a case's key documents and disclosures, framed as an anonymized, composite account, inspired by real cases, a legal disclaimer that felt, once I understood what I was actually listening to, almost cynically calculated. The details weren't composite. They were specific enough, in multiple episodes, that I could match them, with total confidence, to actual people in our own community, simply based on knowledge I happened to already have. I sat with my laptop that night, working through nearly a dozen episodes in a single sitting, cross-referencing details against my own limited knowledge of our town's residents, identifying at least 4 separate cases I felt genuinely confident I could match to real people, real marriages, real private legal proceedings that had never been intended for public consumption in any form, let alone as entertainment monetized through advertising revenue and a paid subscriber tier. The show also offered. That I want to describe the specific, disorienting sensation of that particular night, sitting alone at my kitchen table at nearly 2 a.m, methodically building a spreadsheet. I actually built a spreadsheet, an act that felt simultaneously absurd and completely necessary, cross-referencing podcast episode details against names, dates, and small, identifying facts I happen to know about people in our community. I remember feeling, at various points that night, like I was doing something almost criminal myself, some kind of unauthorized investigation into private matters that weren't technically mine to uncover either. It took me a long time, in the weeks that followed, to fully separate the discomfort from the genuinely important, necessary work of understanding exactly what my husband had actually done. That I didn't confront Evan that night. I want to be honest about the specific, careful process I went through before I did, because I needed considerably more than a strong suspicion before raising something this serious. I spent the following several days doing something that felt deeply uncomfortable, quietly investigating my own husband, listening for vocal patterns and speech habits across additional episodes, cross-referencing case timelines against his own actual work schedule and known client intake periods at his firm, information I had some limited, second-hand familiarity with simply from years of hearing him discuss his general workload, without ever discussing specific case details. The confirmation, when it came, wasn't dramatic. It was a single, specific verbal tick, a particular way Evan says the phrase, at the end of the day, when summarizing a complicated situation, a habit I'd noticed and privately found slightly endearing for years. The paralegal used that exact phrase, in that exact rhythm, in nearly every single episode one listened to. I sat with that confirmation for 2 more days before doing anything further, largely because I needed to understand the actual scope of what he'd done before I said a single word to him about it. I wasn't simply dealing with an uncomfortable personal betrayal at that point. I was potentially dealing with serious professional misconduct, a breach of legally protected confidentiality obligations, and genuine harm done to real people in our own community who had absolutely no idea their private legal proceedings had become entertainment content. During those 2 days, I did something I'm not. I didn't confront Evan that night. I want to be honest about the specific, careful process I went through before I did, because I needed considerably more than a strong suspicion before raising something this serious. I spent the following several days doing something that felt deeply uncomfortable, quietly investigating my own husband, listening for vocal patterns and speech habits across additional episodes, cross-referencing case timelines against his own actual work schedule and known client intake periods at his firm, information I had some limited, second-hand familiarity with simply from years of hearing him discuss his general workload, without ever discussing specific case details. The confirmation, when it came, wasn't dramatic. It was a single, specific verbal tick, a particular way Evan says the phrase, at the end of the day, when summarizing a complicated situation, a habit I'd noticed and privately found slightly endearing for years. The paralegal used that exact phrase, in that exact rhythm, in nearly every single episode one listened to. I sat with that confirmation for 2 more days before doing anything further, largely because I needed to understand the actual scope of what he'd done before I said a single word to him about it. I wasn't simply dealing with an uncomfortable personal betrayal at that point. I was potentially dealing with serious professional misconduct, a breach of legally protected confidentiality obligations, and genuine harm done to real people in our own community who had absolutely no idea their private legal proceedings had become entertainment content. During those 2 days, I did something I'm not particularly proud of, though I understand, in hindsight, exactly why I felt compelled to do it. I quietly reviewed months of our shared financial records, looking for any evidence of payment from the podcast, and found it, a recurring deposit, moderate but consistent, arriving roughly every 2 weeks from an LLC. I didn't recognize one that a quick search revealed was registered to the same production company behind Marriage Autopsy. Seeing that specific, documented financial trail, evidence of actual money changing hands in exchange for other people's private pain, transformed my understanding of what I was dealing with from a troubling suspicion into an unambiguous, provable fact that I called an attorney before I confronted Evan directly, a decision that surprised even me at the time, but one that felt, given the professional and legal complexity involved, genuinely necessary rather than excessive. I retained a lawyer named Diane Ferreira, who specialized in professional ethics and legal malpractice, an unusual specialty I found through a referral once I explained, in careful, general terms, the situation I believed I was dealing with. Diane explained, in our first consultation, the actual legal shape of what Evan had apparently done, and it was considerably more serious than I'd initially understood it to be. I remember feeling a specific, strange guilt during that initial consultation, as though retaining an attorney against my own husband, even one focused specifically on his professional conduct rather than our marriage directly, represented some kind of betrayal on my own part. Diane, sensing that hesitation, told me something during that first meeting that helped me move past it. She said that protecting the affected clients, and understanding the actual scope of professional and legal exposure both Evan and I might be facing, wasn't a betrayal of my marriage. It was, she said, simply responsible, necessary information gathering, entirely separate from whatever decisions I eventually made about my relationship with Evan himself. Paralegals, she explained, are bound by the same fundamental confidentiality obligations that govern the attorneys they work under, obligations that exist specifically to protect clients' most sensitive, private information shared in the course of legal representation. Disclosing confidential client information for personal profit, particularly information detailed and specific enough to potentially identify the actual clients involved, constitutes a serious breach of professional ethics rules, one that could expose Evan personally to disciplinary action, and could expose his firm to significant malpractice liability if any affected client chose to pursue legal action once they understood what had happened to their own case. Diane also explained something that reframed the entire scope of what I was dealing with, that the affected clients themselves would likely have strong grounds for their own separate legal claims, for both breach of confidentiality and potential invasion of privacy, particularly for any cases detailed specifically enough that people in our own small community could reasonably identify the real individuals involved. Exactly the situation I'd already begun to piece together on my own. Diane also raised a question I hadn't fully considered until she asked it directly, whether any of the affected clients had signed engagement agreements with the firm containing specific confidentiality provisions beyond the general professional obligations that would apply regardless. She explained that many family law firms include explicit, written confidentiality clauses in their client agreements specifically because divorce proceedings involve such sensitive personal information, and that a documented, written breach of an explicit contractual provision, on top of the underlying ethical violation, could strengthen any eventual civil claims considerably. I didn't have direct access to those specific engagement agreements myself, but Diane noted this as exactly the kind of detail her office would need to formally investigate once we determined how, and whether, to proceed. That I confronted Evan on a Saturday morning, once Diane and I had discussed, carefully, how to approach the conversation given the serious legal exposure involved, both for him and, potentially, indirectly, for me as his spouse. I played him the specific episode, the one Megan had first described to me, watching his face change through a sequence I recognized, by that point, as familiar from every account I'd ever read of someone caught in exactly this kind of sustained deception, confusion, then a brief, doomed attempt at denial, then, once the specific verbal tick and case details made any remaining denial genuinely impossible, a slow, defeated collapse into something closer to actual explanation. He told me it had started, roughly a year and a half earlier, almost as a joke. A casual conversation with a college friend who worked in podcast production, who'd mentioned, in passing, that true crime and divorce drama content was performing extraordinarily well across multiple platforms, and had half-jokingly suggested Evan's unique professional access to genuinely dramatic real cases could make for compelling material, if he was willing to anonymize the details sufficiently. He described that first, tentative episode as something he genuinely believed, at the time, would be a one-time experiment, a favor to a friend's early-stage podcast rather than the beginning of anything sustained. He said the specific turning point, the moment it shifted from a single favor into an ongoing arrangement, came once that first episode performed considerably better than the show's typical content, prompting the producers to ask, almost immediately, whether he had additional material. He told me that request, arriving at a moment when the positive response to that first episode still felt genuinely flattering, was what made saying yes a second time feel easy. And each subsequent yes, he said, only got easier from there. I asked him directly whether he'd understood, from the very beginning, that what he was doing violated serious professional obligations he'd taken on specifically to protect exactly the. I asked him directly whether he'd understood, from the very beginning, that what he was doing violated serious professional obligations he'd taken on specifically to protect exactly the kind of information he was now selling. The situation escalated considerably beyond our own private confrontation roughly 10 days later, when I learned, through Megan, that a couple 2 streets over from us, people I knew casually through a neighborhood association, had also recognized their own marriage in a recent episode of the podcast. This couple, whom I'll call Janet and Tom to protect their privacy given everything that had already been violated in their case, had gone through an exceptionally difficult, high-conflict divorce roughly 8 months earlier, one that had involved specific, sensitive details about a business dispute and a custody disagreement that, according to Megan, had been detailed in a recent episode with enough specificity that several of their own mutual friends had immediately recognized the case and begun quietly discussing it. I learned, through the same neighborhood grapevine, that Janet had discovered the episode herself, listening to the podcast entirely by coincidence, and had experienced what a mutual friend described as a genuine breakdown upon recognizing details about her own custody arrangement and business dispute, details she had shared only with her own attorney, in confidence, during what she believed was a fully protected legal process, now recounted for entertainment to an audience she had no way of knowing existed at all. I want to be honest about the specific, complicated position I found myself in at that point, understanding that my own husband was directly responsible for what had happened to Janet and Tom, while also understanding I had genuinely had no knowledge of any of it until my own accidental discovery just weeks earlier. I made the difficult decision to reach out to Janet directly, uncertain what I could possibly say that would meaningfully help, but feeling a genuine, urgent obligation to at least ensure she understood the situation was already being addressed, rather than allowing her to continue believing this violation might still be ongoing without any consequence. That I want to describe one specific, deeply uncomfortable evening that followed shortly after Janet and Tom's discovery became known more broadly, because it captures something important about the scale of harm this situation had actually caused, extending well beyond Evan's and my own private reckoning. Our neighborhood association held its regular monthly meeting roughly 2 weeks after Janet's situation had become known to several people in our community, and I made the difficult decision to attend, uncertain whether staying away would look worse than showing up, given that most attendees, by that point, understood at least some version of Evan's connection to everything that had happened. The meeting itself proceeded through its ordinary agenda items with a strained undertone I don't think I imagined, several attendees avoiding direct eye contact with me, others offering the specific, overly careful sympathy people extend when they're uncertain how much blame you personally deserve for something someone close to you has done. I left that meeting earlier than usual, understanding, with a clarity I hadn't fully processed before that evening, that Evan's actions hadn't simply harmed a handful of specific, identifiable clients. They had introduced a genuine, lasting strain of suspicion and discomfort into an entire small community that had, until that point, generally trusted and looked out for each other. Janet's reaction to my outreach, once she understood who I was and why I was reaching out, was raw, understandably furious, and, I think, entirely justified given everything she'd been through without her knowledge or consent. She told me, during a difficult but genuinely important conversation, that discovering her own divorce case detailed on a popular podcast had reopened trauma from an already painful process, compounded by the specific, devastating knowledge that someone she'd trusted implicitly through her own legal representation had been the direct source of that violation. She described the specific moment of recognition, listening to the episode entirely by chance during an ordinary commute, hearing details about her custody arrangement recounted with a casualness that made the entire experience feel, in her words, like watching a stranger read her diary aloud to an audience of thousands. She described feeling, in her own words, like her most private, difficult year had been turned into entertainment for strangers, profit for a podcast, and gossip fuel for people in her own community who now knew details about her custody arrangement she had never intended to share beyond her own attorney's office. I told her, honestly, that I understood if she felt she couldn't separate my own culpability from Evan's, given how directly connected we were. She was quiet for a moment before telling me she appreciated that I'd reached out directly rather than staying silent, and that she intended to pursue formal legal action regardless of anything I personally chose to do, a decision I told her I fully understood and supported, even knowing what it would likely mean for my own marriage and for Evan's professional future. Janet's formal complaint, filed in the following weeks with both the State Bar's Professional Conduct Board and as the basis for a civil claim against Evan's firm directly, became the piece that transformed this from a private marital crisis into a formal, documented professional accountability process, one that, once initiated, several other affected clients, upon learning of Janet's case through local news coverage that eventually followed, came forward to join. Evan's firm's own internal investigation, launched immediately once Janet's formal complaint was received, moved with considerably more speed and severity than either Evan or I had anticipated. The firm's managing partner, once presented with Diane's own preliminary documentation cross-referencing podcast episodes against the firm's actual case files, terminated Evan's employment within days, alongside a formal referral to the State Bar's disciplinary board regarding his conduct, a standard, required response given the serious nature of confirmed client confidentiality violations. The firm also initiated its own broader review of every case Evan had worked on across his tenure, attempting to identify the full scope of affected clients beyond the handful who had, so far, recognized themselves independently. That broader review, completed over several subsequent months, ultimately identified 11 separate cases where Evan had disclosed confidential details to the podcast with enough specificity to constitute a genuine, actionable breach, a number considerably larger than either Evan or I had initially understood, given that several affected clients had apparently never actually recognized their own cases in the podcast's episodes at all, learning about the violation only once the firm proactively notified them following its own internal investigation. I think, often, about those clients specifically, the ones who never would have known at all, had the firm not proactively identified and notified them once Janet's complaint triggered the broader review. There's a particular, unsettling quality to that detail I've sat with considerably since. Some number of people in my own community had their private legal proceedings disclosed publicly for profit, and would have simply lived the rest of their lives never knowing it had happened at all, had circumstances not aligned specifically to bring the entire pattern into the light. I don't know how to fully process that. That specific, sobering detail, beyond understanding that discovery, in cases like this, often depends far more on accident and circumstance than on any inherent likelihood of eventually being caught. The firm ultimately reached individual settlements with several of the affected clients, resolving what would otherwise have become a considerably larger, more complicated set of civil claims, though Diane explained to me that the firm's own malpractice insurance carrier had grounds to potentially seek reimbursement from Evan directly for a portion of those settlement costs, given that his conduct fell well outside any reasonable scope of his employment. Diane walked me through the specific mechanics of that reimbursement process, something called subrogation, where an insurance carrier that pays out a claim can, under certain circumstances, pursue the individual actually responsible for the underlying misconduct to recover some or all of what the carrier paid on the firm's behalf. She explained this was a genuinely serious financial exposure for Evan personally, potentially extending well beyond whatever the podcast had actually paid him over the 18 months he'd been providing material, since the settlement amounts negotiated with affected clients were, by their nature, considerably larger than the relatively modest per-episode payments Evan himself had received. The podcast itself, once local news coverage of Janet's complaint and the firm's subsequent investigation became public, faced its own separate reckoning, one I followed with a specific, complicated mixture of feelings given my own role in how everything had unfolded. The show's hosts, in a statement released once the story gained broader attention, claimed they had genuinely believed Evan's account of thorough anonymization and had no independent way of verifying the actual, specific accuracy of the cases he'd provided, a defense Diane described as legally plausible but ethically thin, given that any reasonable, careful podcast production process should have included independent verification of exactly the kind of confidentiality assurances Evan had apparently provided them. The podcast ultimately removed the specific episodes identified as involving genuine, non-consenting real individuals, though Diane was candid that removal from the platform itself could never fully undo months of the episodes already having been downloaded, shared, and discussed by tens of thousands of listeners before their eventual removal, a limitation I'd already understood, in a different context, from everything Diane had explained to me about digital content generally. I don't know, and have deliberately chosen not to pursue further, whether the podcast itself faced any additional formal legal consequences beyond the episode removals and the reputational damage that followed the story's broader local news coverage. I made a specific, deliberate decision, once my own role in surfacing the situation was complete, to step back from continuing to actively follow every subsequent development, understanding that continuing to monitor it closely wasn't actually serving my own healing process in any meaningful way. I did learn, secondhand through a brief mention in the same local news coverage that had first brought broader attention to the situation, that the podcast's production company had announced a formal policy change going forward, requiring signed, independently verified consent from any real individual whose case details were used in future episodes, a change the article characterized as a direct response to the controversy. I found a small, specific measure of grim satisfaction in that particular detail, understanding that whatever else remained unresolved or unknown to me, at least one concrete, structural change had emerged from everything that happened, one that might genuinely prevent some future version of this exact violation from happening to someone else. I want to address directly what happened between Evan and me, because I think it's the part of this story people are, understandably, most curious about, and because I don't want to avoid it simply because it's difficult to discuss honestly. Evan and I separated within the same month I discovered what he'd been doing, a decision I made with a clarity that surprised me, given how disorienting the initial discovery itself had been. I want to be honest that my decision wasn't purely about the professional misconduct itself, serious as that was. It was about the specific, sustained deception required to maintain it. Nearly 18 months of quiet, deliberate lying, woven seamlessly into an otherwise ordinary, functioning marriage, conducted with a level of calm, practiced normalcy that unsettled me considerably once I fully understood how long he'd been capable of maintaining it directly alongside our actual, day-to-day life together. I asked him, during one of our final conversations before formally separating, whether he'd ever considered what discovery would eventually mean, not just for his career, but for the actual people whose private pain he'd been monetizing. He told me he'd thought about it, particularly in the final months, as the podcast's audience had grown considerably larger and the risk of exactly this kind of recognition had grown correspondingly more likely. He said he'd simply kept telling himself the anonymization was sufficient, the same rationalization, I now understood, that had allowed him to continue for as long as he had, directly parallel to whatever comparable rationalization had let him continue lying to me across that same period. Our divorce, filed roughly 2 months after my initial discovery, proceeded relatively straightforwardly given how clearly established the underlying facts already were by that point, though I found a specific, difficult irony in navigating my own divorce proceedings through the exact legal system whose confidentiality Evan had so thoroughly violated for other people's cases, an irony that wasn't lost on either Diane or me as we worked through my own case together. I made a specific, deliberate point, throughout my own divorce proceedings, of asking every professional I worked with directly about their own confidentiality practices and safeguards, a level of scrutiny I don't think I would have thought to apply before everything that had happened with Evan, but that felt, by that point, like an entirely reasonable, necessary precaution given exactly what I now understood was actually possible. Diane, to her credit, welcomed those questions rather than finding them excessive, walking me through her own firm's specific document handling and confidentiality protocols in more detail than I'd ever previously thought to ask any professional for, in any context. Before this entire ordeal forced me to understand exactly why that level of diligence actually matters. That I don't tell this story to suggest every paralegal or legal professional poses some hidden risk to client confidentiality, or that most professional discretion is secretly concealing something sinister. The overwhelming majority of legal professionals take confidentiality obligations exactly as seriously as they present themselves to. What Evan did was the result of one specific person's deliberate, sustained decision to exploit legitimate professional access for personal profit, rationalized through an anonymization process he knew, even as he continued it, was genuinely insufficient to actually protect the real people involved. If there's something practical I'd ask you to take from this, particularly if you or someone you love is currently navigating a divorce or any other sensitive legal proceeding, it's this: understand that while attorneys and legal professionals are bound by serious, enforceable confidentiality obligations, those obligations depend entirely on individual professionals actually honoring them, and violations, when they happen, often go completely undetected until pure chance, the way Megan's casual mention of a podcast episode did in my own case, happens to surface them. I think, often, about Janet, and about the other affected clients I never personally met, people whose most painful, private year became content for strangers without their knowledge or consent. I don't know that anything I did, once I discovered what Evan had been doing, meaningfully undid the actual harm already done to them. What I do know is that staying silent, once I understood the full scope of it, was never something I could have lived with, regardless of what it ultimately meant for my own marriage. Janet and I have spoken a handful of times since her formal complaint concluded, conversations that remain difficult but that I've come to genuinely value, in their own complicated way. She told me, during one of our more recent conversations, that she'd initially assumed, given my connection to Evan, that reaching out to her had been motivated primarily by some form of self-interest, a desire to manage my own reputation within our shared community rather than any genuine concern for what she'd actually experienced. She said it had taken her considerable time to understand my outreach as sincere rather than self-serving, and that she appreciated, in hindsight, that I'd chosen to reach out directly rather than simply staying quiet and letting the situation unfold without any acknowledgement from me at all. If this story affected you, or if you've ever discovered that someone you trusted had been exploiting a position of professional trust for reasons you never could have imagined, I want to hear about it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. There are more of these stories, and more of what I've learned about rebuilding trust in professional and personal relationships alike, every day.